Okay, so today I was going to go through a couple of the topics and concepts in learning. From the posts that I saw, everything looked really, really good, except that I'm not sure how many people are shying away from the classical conditioning post because maybe the terminology is might be a little confusing to read, but if you hear it, it might be better. So. Um, Here we go. I'm going to start with classical conditioning, but this is all in the topic of learning, right? So in the topic of learning, we're just going to go through an introduction to learning, right? A relatively permanent change in behavior, and I'm going to add thoughts. Okay, so a relatively permanent change in behavior or thoughts, which results from experience. So a relatively permanent change in behavior or thoughts which results from experience. So, in other words, when people get very frustrated or when they say that you don't learn, it's because the same mistake is made a couple of times. So, you made a mistake and then it had a bad consequence and then you did it again. You weren't careful again. And so that's when people get a little bit frustrated, and when we get frustrated with ourselves for making the same mistake, for example, in relationships repeatedly, right? Keep falling for the same person who's not good for you. Keep being nice to the person who's not good to you. And you know that it doesn't lead anywhere good, but yet you keep doing it. So that's frustrating. So, and that would be an example of not learning according to this definition. Okay, so we're going to go through three types of learning. Classical conditioning. Conditioning is just another word for learning. So the first we're going to go through is classical conditioning. The second is operant conditioning. So first is classical condition, second is operant conditioning, and the third is social learning, which we'll touch on very, very briefly. Social learning is also called observational learning. Right? So social learning is also called observational learning. Same thing. Okay, so that's the agenda for today, the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, so I don't know if you can hear my dog lapping away at her water bowl. All right, so we're going to look at Ivan Pavlov. I know we've probably you've read more about Freud, and psychologists were focusing on the unconscious for decades. And then they decided we don't really want it to be about the unconscious, because the unconscious is not something that you could prove, not something you could see. We want it based on something you could see, and so we want it based on behavior, not unconscious thoughts. So John Watson is one of those psychologists who felt that way. So they believed that you should take a look at Ivan Pavlov's work. Some of you have been exposed to this in biology. So you've got Ivan Pavlov's work in biology. Now, some textbooks, they'll talk about the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. And the unconditioned stimulus they'll put as US. I just like to do UCS because it's called conditioning. So I like to have that initial in there, the C for conditioning, because that's what we're talking about, learning, right? Learning is the same as conditioning. And the unconditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus yields the unconditioned response, or leads to or elicits the unconditioned response. Okay, so that's what the arrow means. So when we're talking about, let me just give you this so that you see it. So again, the unconditioned stimulus elicits or leads to the unconditioned response, elicits, ELICITS. Okay, so unconditioned stimulus is UCS, unconditioned response is UCR. Now, what happened with Ivan Pavlov is he was not interested in conditioning. He was interested in salivation, but he found that the dogs were salivating to the lab tech who was bringing them the food, and it was messing up his study of salivation, of the process of salivation. And because they were salivating when they weren't supposed to salivate, they were salivating not only to the food, but to the lab tech, even when the lab tech did not have food. So Ivan Pavlov correctly suspected that maybe there was an association being formed. And so classical conditioning, which this is also called associative conditioning, or learning by association. So he found, right, that if you pair a conditioned stimulus, okay, so the CS is conditioned stimulus. If you pair a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus repeatedly, if you pair this over and over and over again, eventually that conditioned stimulus, even when it's not paired with an unconditioned stimulus, so in other words, the conditioned stimulus is presented on its own, that conditioned stimulus will yield or will elicit the conditioned response. So in Ivan Pavlov's work, which again you might have been exposed to this in another class, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, the unconditioned response is salivation. Unconditioned, so unlearned. No one had to teach you to salivate to food, right? So it's not like your parents sat you up in a high chair and was like, here, learn how to salivate to this. You just do it. If you want, you just walk around the house with the Kit Kat bar in your mouth and you'll see that you'll be salivating. And no one ever taught you to do that, right? So the food is the unconditioned stimulus. Salivation to the food is the unconditioned response. It was paired repeatedly. Ivan Pavlov did a new experiment where he paired the food with, the food with a bell over and over and over again. And once he paired with the food over and over and over again with the bell, over time, you could present the bell by itself and the dogs would salivate to the bell. So the salivation to the bell is the conditioned response. Okay? So that's all that is, right? I just have that written over here so you can see it. Again, food led to salivation to the food. So your unconditioned stimulus and your unconditioned response. And the bell led to salivation to the bell. So the bell is the conditioned stimulus and the salivation to the bell is the conditioned response. Okay, so psychologists felt this is what psychology should be part of, should be looking at, not dreams, not Oedipal complexes. We should be looking at this. One of the leaders was John Watson. And John Watson, with his 20-year-old assistant, whom he later married, Rosalie Rayner, in 1920, came out with conditioned emotional responses. It's an article, you could find it in the library. But they had, again, they were looking at, let's look at how unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses, let's see how, and dissociative learning, let's see how that's related to phobias, right? So for him, he worked backwards, right? So the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, he wanted a little boy, a 9-month-old boy named Little Albert. He took this 9-month-old, Little Albert's not his real name, but he took this 9-month-old boy. I believe he was a friend, an associate's son. And he said, if you do this experiment, your son will be well known. And it's true, he is well known, but I don't think he's well known in the way that they wanted him to be well known. And you'll see what I mean in a second. And this is an unethical experiment by today's standards, but back then they didn't have the standards that we do now. Again, it's a 1920s study, so it's 100 years ago. So, or more, right? By the time you see this video. So conditioned stimulus, he wanted little Albert to fear a white rat because he wanted to explain phobias, sort of in direct contrast to Freud's book, The Sexual Enlightenment of Children, where Freud explains little Hans's fear or phobia of horses in terms of the Oedipal complex. So John Watson is going to go in and he's going to say it's not the Oedipal complex, it's just dissociative learning, or it's just classical conditioning. So here we have, he says, I'm going to teach this 9-month-old boy to fear a white rat. So what he does is he starts out with that. That's his end point, right? So he starts with that, and then he works backwards. He says, well, what do they fear naturally without learning? What do they fear? What do little kids fear naturally without learning? And then we'll pair those two together over and over and over again. Students over the years have, when I ask them, what do you think, kids are afraid of, naturally I get a lot of responses. Some have said clowns, some have said darkness, and those are good ideas, but they took like a cheap, fast way, and it worked very well, which was a loud noise, right? So even as adults, we still jump at loud noises. Nobody teaches you. No one, again, sits you up in a high chair and like makes loud noises until you're scared. You're scared of loud noises when they happen. You have that startled response. And so how they created the loud noise was they struck 2 steel bars behind his head, the 9-month-old boy's head, whom they're calling Little Albert. So they've got the loud noise, right? They pair it repeated and repeated. You see in the article, they do it over a span of, I think it's months, and then they say, they give you the week that they pair it, and then the next week they pair it, and it's in decent detail. And so they pair it over and over again, and then what happens is that he is afraid. He eventually becomes afraid of the white rat, even though he was not afraid, and they had tested him beforehand. Before the experiment, they saw that he wasn't afraid. Just like a lot of kids, right? They'll grab a big dog by the ears. They'll let like mice crawl on them. They don't have fear. It comes through this learning, right? This association. Now, this kind of association can happen, right, in one pairing. So, for example, it can happen in one pairing with a car accident, right? You could, if it's traumatic, you have a car accident. So it's the car accident leads to the fear, and then whatever you associate with it in that one pairing. So it could be the location of the car accident. It could be the car that you were in. It could be the state that you were in. It could be the intersection. It could be the person you're driving with. You never want to drive with them again, right? So that's an example of how it can happen in one pairing, right? You now fear those things: the intersection, the car, the type of car, the person, the condition, the weather conditions that you were driving in. And then we have also love feelings too, right? So if you're really, really a tremendous behaviorist, you might think love feelings. You can explain love feelings with this, right? You like, nice events make you happy. Nice events. Being treated well makes you happy, right? And so you associate that person who treats you well over and over again with being happy, right? So you're happy with that person because of what they bring you. So very, very different model from Freud's model at that time. I also wanted to let you know, going back to Little Albert, that by the end of that experiment, with, this is Ivan Pavlov. By the end of that experiment with Little Albert, he was not only afraid of the white rat, but he was also afraid of bunnies, a dog, a Santa Claus mask, and John Watson's beard. So anything white, anything fuzzy. He was also afraid of cotton. And so that's what they call stimulus generalization, when you are afraid of things that are similar to the stimulus. Okay, so I'm just going to, I just went through that so that you are comfortable kind of looking through that part of the chapter, and so that you don't skip it, because classical conditioning is a very important part of psychology. So you could take a whole class in learning. Actually, it's one of my favorite courses. So I don't want you to shy away from that just because you're seeing like the new terms. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward if someone walks you through. So our second type of learning is operant conditioning. So that first type was classical conditioning, where we're talking about unconditioned stimuli, unconditioned responses, unconditioned stimuli, and conditioned responses. So the second type is operant conditioning. This is learning through consequences, which is all over the place, right? So you learn through consequences, right? Getting good grades. This is like learning through reward and punishment. So again, it's all over the place. It's all over our school system. It's all over our justice system. So we've got Edward Thorndike's little cat, right? So Thorndike had a puzzle box, and he put a little cat in there, a hungry cat, and he put food right outside the box. Now the cat didn't know this, but it had a little lever, and he could press that lever and then get out of the box. But again, the cat didn't know this, so the first time he goes in there, the cat's whining and crying and pacing and scratching. And usually by accident, right, it will start to... Okay. All right, we're gonna close this door. Hold on one second. Okay, all sorts of noise happening tonight. Okay, so usually by accident he will find the way out, or not the way out, but he will find the lever. Now the second time the cat goes in, he's going to spend less time clawing and crying and scratching and meowing, and he's going to go more quickly to the lever. And over several trials, what you're going to find is that the cat is just going, when you put the cat in the box, he's going to go straight to the lever and go right out. Same thing with like when you go into class, you go and you sit down, and you know what to do as a college student, right? But if you had 3 or 4-year-olds and you put them in a classroom with all seats and desks, it would take a lot of time for them to settle down and sit down, right? So it takes years and years of being rewarded. Okay, so Thorndike, right? He's got the law of effect, and which is similar to Skinner's principle of reinforcement, right? So Thorndike's law of effect and Skinner's principle of reinforcement states that any behavior that is strengthened by a positive consequence is more likely to occur in the future, right? So any behavior that is reinforced or strengthened is more likely to occur in the future, right? So that's positive reinforcement, when somebody gives you a reward for doing something well, right? So that's positive reinforcement. Attention and praise work extremely well, right? Stickers for kids, that works well. Grades work, money works, right? And then there's some rewards that are better than others, right? You also have negative reinforcement. I just wanted to clarify negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the strengthening of a response by the removal of a stimulus, right? So it's not that you're punishing someone. Punishing somebody decreases the likelihood of a response. Reinforcement is always going to increase the likelihood of a response. It just depends how you do it. Are you going to increase the likelihood of a response by presenting something or by taking it away? If you are increasing the likelihood of a response by presenting something, such as giving candy or giving money, that's positive reinforcement. If you do it by taking away, that's negative reinforcement. And usually that negative thing is like negative, like it's like pressure, right? So like torture confessions. If somebody is torturing you so that they can get that confession out of you, it makes you more likely to confess. It's what they want. So once you confess, they take it away. That's negative reinforcement. Nagging is also negative reinforcement, right? So are you going to take out the garbage? You're going to take out the garbage. When are you going to take out the garbage? They'll take out the garbage to get you to stop nagging them. An alarm clock is also negative reinforcement, where you have the noise going on, and so you have to wake up in order to stop the noise. Also, the car seat belt, when that little alarm rings, the car seat belt is off, it'll get you to put that car seat belt on just to get those bells to stop. Right? So that's operant conditioning. Very quickly, social learning or observational learning. That's just learning through watching. Right? So you learn through watch. That's also very powerful. It's also called modeling, right? So if you see somebody doing something and then you imitate it. Children are known to imitate. So they're like Albert Bandura's work is very important. When you see somebody doing something, even if it's on a screen, you're more likely to do it. So that's the third type of learning. But I think if you read that section, if you read about that, that's very straightforward. So anyway, this was just an introduction to get you going on the reading. Some of you have already done it, again, done a really great job, but this is just to catch anyone who might have been shying away from that reading because of all the terms. So All right, email me with any questions, and I'll see you later.